GCSE was terrible. And she had thought several of the poems terrible, and then named as a particular example a poet and a poem that I'd never heard of. It seemed unlikely to me. You assume the exam boards at that level of education know what they're doing and take it on trust that they're doing a good job. It chanced later last year that I came on a copy of this exam board's anthology of poetry. In other words, poems set for study for students aged 14 to 16. The particular poem mentioned by the school student was there and was indeed very poor. But as I read on, I was more and more surprised by reading poems by poets I had never heard of, and often poor and second-rate poems. At that point, I thought I should take it further. Perhaps only one exam board was to blame. As it turned out, the syllabus was representative. The other boards, working to similar criteria and agendas, were also setting poor quality poems. So why did the exam board set bad poems became a pertinent question. Given the boards are obviously well-meaning, why would this be? They have a huge cultural impact. English language and English literature are interrelated at GCSE. So these anthologies affect about 600,000 students a year. In this lecture, to try and understand what's going wrong, I will be looking in particular at 3 GCSE poetry syllabuses, currently prescribed by the main exam boards in England. The anthology titled A Moon on the Tides, by the AQA exam board, the poetry anthology of the Edexcel exam board, more prosaically called Poetry Anthology, first issued in January 2010, and lastly, the revised syllabus coming into use by the OCR exam board, Specification 360 for English Literature. To defend themselves, I think, the boards are starting to say that their set texts have been chosen by teachers working across our 3 specifications. That's OCR, or again AQA. The poems have been chosen by teachers and examiners to appeal to a range of students. It is not clear how this vox populi mechanism works, or what kind, quality, or quantity of teachers have been surveyed or consulted. From my discussions with senior teachers, it is clear that it is not producing a good result. In the end, the boards must be responsible for the set texts they choose and their impact. Certainly the problem is not solely the board's fault, for their experts, in their choice of contemporary poets, are often latching onto questionable valuations emerging more widely. I leave this aside for the moment. Let's be clear simply that there is a large body of professional opinion from teachers working in different kinds of school and from senior academics that says that the board's anthologies of poetry are poor quality overall. In an interview given by Geoffrey Hill, England's greatest living poet, to this university's own Chris Woodhead a couple of years ago, Chris Woodhead is a great friend of Geoffrey Hill. Hill commented on the relatively marginal nature of poetry within the wider culture, and wondered what it would be like if John Humphreys of the Radio 4 Today programme grilled interviewees about poetry as rigorously as he interviews them about economics or science. In this spirit, I fantasize the following exchange. It is a bleary 7:15 on a cold September morning. In the one corner, Mr. Humphreys, his usual ebullient self. In the other, a representative of the AQA exam board in fear and trembling. Mr. Humphreys, I have to be frank with you, Mr. X. This lecture by Stefan Hawlin makes clear that your board has been setting substandard poetry anthologies for years at GCSE, that our children's literary and aesthetic education is being impaired, and that this is weakening their overall education experience. It says here that these bad anthologies are part of and are contributing to a wider cultural weakness. Cultural weakness, what do you say to that? So Mr. X says, good morning, John. Well, I think these claims are exaggerated, don't you? What we have here is one, perhaps a group of academics complaining, I want to assure your listeners that the anthology was compiled by experts in consultation with teachers, and that many experts think it's excellent. Children's aesthetic education is safe in our hands. Mr. Humphreys, but really, it can't be just brushed off like that. Our children's education is being damaged. It says here categorically, I'm quoting, the exam boards are bypassing the great tradition of English poetry. The exam boards, just listen to this, I'm quoting from the lecture, Mr. X. The exam boards are enthralled to the present moment, to false notions of accessibility and relevance, to a false version of multiculturalism, and to certain modish evaluations within a literary culture. What do you have to say to that? Mr. X, by now he's a little ruffled at Mr. Humphreys' vehemence. Well, I'm not sure what a false version of multiculturalism means. We want to represent the wide diversity of British life in the poems chosen, and poets from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. And so the interview would go on. Mr. Humphreys harrying his opponent in characteristic fashion, and the representative of the exam boards trying to screw him out of it. I fantasize this exchange because I think it's unlikely to happen. And the reasons for this are, I think, worth pondering. If the exam boards were issuing textbooks in science with errors, they would be picked up straight away. But bad taste in poems is somehow different. Various factors are in play here. The main one, obviously, is the wide failure of critical standards and critical authority in our culture. Underlying this are two things. Firstly, subjectivism and relativism. Relativism in this context is the notion that you can't tell the difference between a good and a bad poem, that there is no real difference, that it's meaningless to speak of good and bad art. Subjectivism in this context is the notion that my personal taste is always going to be right, that there are no objective tests, no objective critical standards. Personal preference rules and is authoritative. Immaturity of taste is impossible. What underlies all this, if we strip it away, is the simple fact that not enough people have had a profound engagement or encounter with a great poem. Not enough people know that kind of impact of art, the experience of the aesthetic, in other words. The experience, often enough, of wonder. For critical standards can only come to exist within a community that has real experiences of art. The study of poetry as part of education sits firmly within the field of the humanities. Those crucial things, art, history, politics, philosophy, and theology. Those subjects are obviously highly interconnected. Poetry sits within that field and reaches out to all of them, implicitly or explicitly. Whether at school or at university, to study a range of serious poetry means implicitly or explicitly reaching out to art, history, politics, philosophy, and theology. A daunting thought in one sense, but part of the fascination in another. Once we have got past the myth that science is omnicompetent to answer all questions, once we have got past the myth that the primary purpose of education is to increase GDP, then we are into the territory where we can say that an ideal of education, based, say, following Simon Weil, on the creation and sustaining of civilization, makes some kind of sense. The myriad filaments of connection here are obvious, but again challenging, and part of the enriching nature of the study of poetry. If you're going to understand T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, you are going to need to think carefully about vegetation myths, early religion, the true nature of sexuality, Hindu religion, and the role of Dante within European culture. And that might only get you started. If you want to understand Yeats's great poem, Prayer for My Daughter, of 1919, you're going to need to know something about how a father might feel about his newborn baby daughter. But you're also going to need to know about colonialism, the Anglo-Irish War, and Yeats's heterodox religion. Therefore, you might need to know about less heterodox religion. Take a more recent example, Geoffrey Hill's In Memoriam Ernst Barlach. You're going to need to know about Ernst Barlach's works. Why the Nazis had his great memorial to the First World War dead removed from Magdeburg Cathedral in 1934. Why his work was included in the Nazi exhibition of degenerate art in 1937 in Munich. The sense of beauty, the sense of wonder, is actually crucial to any real idea of education. But beauty is a word we get nervous about. Of course, I don't simply mean what is lovely. A work of art can be brutal, stark, and strange, King Lear, for example, or indeed Ernst Barlach's Magdeburg War Memorial, and yet intensely beautiful. I mean beauty as Aquinas defined it, something showing integritas, consonantia, and claritas, wholeness, harmony, and radiance. Here I direct you to the end of James Joyce's great novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where Joyce has his protagonist, Stephen Dedalus, theorize about beauty on lines derived from the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. This passage from the novel has had a significant influence on 20th century aesthetic thinking. It's irresistible to quote just a part of it, the end of the passage on claritas. Stephen Dedalus, the character in the novel, is trying to articulate what Thomas Aquinas means by claritas, or radiance, as he translates it, as an aspect of beauty. And he comes up with this. The radiance of which he speaks is the scholastic quidditas, the whatness of a thing. This supreme quality is felt by the artist when the aesthetic image is first conceived in his imagination. The mind in that mysterious instant Shelley likened beautifully to a fading coal. The instant wherein that supreme quality of beauty, the clear radiance of the aesthetic image, is apprehended luminously by the mind, which has been arrested by its wholeness and fascinated by its harmony, is the luminous, silent stasis of aesthetic pleasure. A spiritual state very much like that cardiac condition which the Italian physiologist Luigi Galvani, using a phrase almost as beautiful as Shelley's, called the enchantment of the heart. The enchantment of the heart. In quoting at length from Joyce, I am pulling round to the none too original, but often neglected truth, that only certain kinds of experience of the good, the true, and the beautiful, that Platonic Trinity. It's only within certain kinds of experience of the good, the true, and the beautiful that it becomes possible to experience the force or intrigue of certain kinds of question. Some kind of experience of the beautiful is not an add-on to education, but fundamental to it, whether experienced through music or painting or poetry or in some other way. For without it, you have sensibilities formed for whom aspects of the world are largely shut off, largely don't function. Let's turn to the anthologies I've named. As I implied earlier, I want to consider the failings of the examples anthologies under four headings. Firstly, their abandonment of any notion of roots and tradition. Secondly, their version of accessibility and relevance. Third, their version of multiculturalism. And fourth, questions relating to taste and beauty, i.e. aesthetic, or just the same, artistic value. First, why is it that the examples have abandoned any idea of roots and tradition? If you look at the graph, I've put together the dates for poems in the Edexcel and AQA anthologies, for both have the same pattern. In the Edexcel anthology, which is now up, of the 60 poems, the overwhelming preponderance come from the last 10 years. Or, even more, the last 3 decades, only 8 poems come from before the 20th century. Now, I think it's a good idea, highly appropriate, to set contemporary poets for this age group. Any good anthology would contain good contemporary poems. But here we have a tokenistic attitude to the past. Let's suppose an enthusiastic student who decides to read the whole anthology, not just the 15 poems in one of the selections. That student will get the impression that Ingrid de Kock and Sherman Hardy are crucial and important poets. He or she will not even find the names of Donne, Herbert, Marvell, Dryden, Poe, Keats, Byron, Tennyson, and so forth and so on. One could go on, but you can see the point. The AQA anthology follows the same pattern. There it is. Almost nothing in the early centuries, and actually everything very recent. What is striking is not simply the preponderance of 20th century poems, but the fact that most poems are from the last 2 decades. Let's start with a practical point. What teachers who object to the board's selections have told me, something that tallies with my own experience, is that it is just as hard to explain the limited, often jejune or awkward complexities of a bad contemporary poem, as to explain the stimulating and justified complexities of a classic poem from a previous century. Indeed, explaining the meaning and the expression, the ethos and the technique of a bad poem is a bit like explaining a bad joke to someone who didn't get it the first time. It's a painful process. Moreover, masterpieces from previous centuries have many commentaries and glosses on them, now often available on the web. In default of these, the boards could easily supply their own commentaries. The larger issue here is that of difficulty, regardless of the era in which the poem comes from. The boards are wary of setting so-called difficult poems lest they lose their audience. That is well and good as a general emphasis, but surely setting poems that are accessible doesn't mean having to set poems that are always shallow in aesthetic terms. And surely, too, for more able students, a few poems that set some higher level of challenge would be a good idea. Many of the great poems in English are multi-layered, easy in terms of surface meaning, but with huge reserves of complexity, nuance, and depth. Blake's Sick Rose, for example, or Frost's The Road Not Taken. Many of the contemporary poems that the board have chosen are really idea poems. They show little distinction or interest in terms of their technique, i.e. their texture of language and expression. These poems are often one-dimensional. You get the single thought offered, and that's it. Imtiaz Dakar's The Right Word, from The Terrorist at My Table, is set by AQA, and it's a case in point. Outside the door, lurking in the shadows, is a terrorist. Is that the wrong description? Outside the door, taking shelter in the shadows, is a freedom fighter. The poem goes on in that vein. It makes the honourable point that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. But that's it. It's too accessible, you might say. You get the idea in a few seconds, and then there's no more on offer. Or again, take John Agard's poem, Flag. What's that fluttering in the breeze? It's just a piece of cloth that brings a nation to its knees. What's that unfurling from a pole? It's just a piece of cloth that makes the guts of men grow bold. And so it goes on and on. Verbally, it's plodding. It's repeating one thought, a flag as a symbol of militaristic nationalism. In Paris with You is about an older man, how much older the poem doesn't say, with a younger woman in Paris. He's wounded from previous relationships. He's been to Paris before and doesn't want to go to the Louvre, Notre Dame, the standard tourist sites. He is nervous of speaking about love. He wants to stay in the hotel room and have sex. So we have this. Don't talk to me of love, let's talk of Paris. I'm in love, Paris, with the slightest thing you do. I'm in Paris with your eyes, your mouth. I'm in Paris with all points south. Am I embarrassing you? I'm in Paris with you. It's a light comic poem, but so thin in texture, offering the reader so little, and frankly, not really offering much insight into the particular life it evokes, and embarrassing in a way that it's not meant to be embarrassing. Why should most school children in England, who can't afford a trip to Paris, be interested in the dramatic voice of a middle-class man struggling with problems about love? This brings me to my third point of criticism, the exam board's obsession with one version of multiculturalism. There are different ways of recognizing the complex and evolving cultural diversity of Britain. But unfortunately, the exam boards have chosen a limited way. David Cameron has spoken of the dangers of the balkanizing of society. Clearly, the exam boards take this seriously in terms of their syllabuses. They have self-consciously set out to pick poems by a set of writers of diverse ethnic and national background. So far as literature can do this, they are determined that what David Cameron has called the walls of division will be torn down. They are determined, in Rowan Williams' terms, not to return to a style of teaching literature and history that stresses a central definitive story. A central definitive story. So far, so good. The problem is that, by and large, they have no story to tell at all. Just that we are ethnically diverse, that this has and continues to produce tensions. This is what Rowan Williams calls static pluralism. Like a box of assorted chocolates, we all sit together in the box and never actually talk to each other or learn from each other. There is no possibility of mutual and reciprocal influence. This version of multiculturalism is also often either brutally sincere or terribly sentimental, but rarely really alert and morally engaged. Here I would direct you to Rowan Williams' discussion, Multiculturalism, Friend or Foe, in his Faith in the Public Square. He says this: static pluralism is not a healthy condition for a society, and the well-intentioned eagerness of some in recent decades to compensate for insensitive cultural hegemony by treating all clusters of cultural and religious expression as equally worthy of respect and equally distant from the public square has not delivered quite what was intended. At first, it might look as though in saying this, I am being unfair to the boards, for anti-racism is one of their favourite themes. The problem here is the nature of the poems they set, and in particular, the nature of poems by two of their favourite poets, John Agard and Benjamin Zephaniah. Agard and Zephaniah are great anti-racist campaigners, and they're also great performance artists. But in the case of the poems in the anthologies, they are not actually good poets. What we have essentially is texts for their performance art, the texts that they use for their dramatic performances. But these are different from good poems as such. Let's take John Agard's Half-Caste, which castigates that turn of use, and Benjamin Zephaniah's poem about the murder of Stephen Lawrence, what Stephen Lawrence has taught us. As I've said, Agard and Zephaniah are important anti-racist campaigners. A man may, for example, be a good man morally, but not a good footballer. Football has its own skills, methods, and means. So with poetry, a true political or moral statement does not in itself make for a good poem, make good art, because it does not, on its own, engage the resources of poetry. In the case of this particular poem, two things follow. Firstly, I suspect the poem will only persuade those already persuaded. Secondly, we may wonder if, considered as poetry, it is actually right to approach this level of atrocity with this kind of poetic manner and mode. The poem is dealing with something very dark, a manifestation of a real cancer in our society. Is the easy and smooth poetic manner and mode really appropriate aesthetically or morally, inseparable here, of course, to the darkness, hurt, and atrocity of the subject matter? Here are some lines from the poem. We know who the killers are. We have watched them strut before us, as proud as sickness or weakness. We have watched them strut before us, compassionless and arrogant. They paraded before us like angels of death, protected by the law. The death of Stephen Lawrence has taught us to love each other and never to take the tedious task of waiting for a bus for granted. Watching his parents, watching the cover-up, begs the question, what are the trading standards here? Why are we praying for a police force? Why are we paying? Why are we paying for a police force that will not work for us? It might be true, but it's not poetry. Poems that are weak or relatively weak in aesthetic terms are often shut off, as here, from moral depth, via their bypassing of the means of art itself. The poem doesn't really bring home the level of atrocity, because it doesn't do what art should do with this level of atrocity, unsettle us. So contrary to what might appear to be the case, the boards are not actually setting anthologies which make for a good education for a shared culture, i.e. anthologies that might resource serious discussion of difference and mutual exchange in the classroom. It is interesting how, while they are happy to set poems on race and nationalism, they do not set poems on religion, though you would think that occasions in the classroom to discuss religious difference and similarity would be useful if we are really going to bring down Cameron's walls of division. In the board's world, even religious doubt is excluded. In the public arena, new atheists like Richard Dawkins slug it out with their opponents, yet none of this enters the world of the board's anthologies. Our finest contemporary novelist, Ian McEwan, hinges his recent novel Saturday on the great 19th century poem of religious doubt, Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. As his novel makes movingly clear, this is because for him it is still very much a current poem and second-rate poems. I'll name a few. Of course there can be arguments about taste, and within certain boundaries tastes vary. But I would challenge the boards to find a single knowledgeable critic, a real authority, who would back them by saying that any of the following were really good poems. Poppies by Jane Weir, Brothers by Andrew Forster, Invasion by Stefan Hawlin, Sea Timeless Song by Grace Nichols, Rubbish at Adultery by Sophie Hannah, City Blues by Mike Hayhoe, Cape Town Morning by Ingrid de Kock, and Hard Water by Jean Sprackland. This list could be much extended. Even when choosing from good and canonical poets, the boards have made strange choices. Thomas Hardy is one of the great English lyric poets, but The Ruined Maid, chosen by AQA, is a very minor comic poem indeed. Bayonet Charge is one of Ted Hughes' least good poems, yet it's again the board's choice. Examples could be multiplied. Is there some general weakness in poetry of our time, or the critical apprehension of poetry in our time that the boards are looking into? I think some critics would say so. It's democratic, whereas until fairly recently it was elitist. Poetry is serious, but not boring, witty, but not frivolous, emotional, but tough. Against these, he sets the preceding prevailing assumptions, which he clearly prefers. Here are some examples. Poetry is diachronic as well as synchronic. That is, it has a life beyond the immediate circumstances of its composition and publication. At the simplest level, this means that as readers, we return to favourite poems over and over again, and in a more complex way, the double life of a poem underlies Avon Boland's remark that I want a poem I can grow old in, I want a poet I can die with the human heart. But maybe it helps. However, when the board's chosen poems encourage quick, soundbite ideas, they only foster the vulgarity of the heart. As I've already implied, the formal teaching of poetry in schools sits within a nexus comprising, whether formally or informally, art, history, politics, philosophy, and theology. Here, I think we have to think seriously about what has gone wrong and is going wrong with our present mentality and mindset. Reason and intelligence are crucial, but certain kinds of instrumental ways of using them, operating within a disconnected and egoistic mindset, have generated a financial crisis, and more importantly, an ongoing environmental crisis. Different philosophers and theologians have made this point in different ways. We know we have to educate for a different mindset, readjust some of our priorities within from many of the requirements of routine instrumental thinking. Art moves from and into a depth in the perceptible world that is contained neither in routine perception nor in the artist's conscious or unconscious purposes. Parts of education may be concerned with mastering knowledge, mastering aspects of our understanding of the world. But the deepening of our imaginations and our encounters with beauty are part of the way in which we encounter mystery and a certain existential humility, take more seriously, and take more seriously ideas of critical standards and critical authority. As I hope I've shown, at the moment school students are being shortchanged in the poems presented to them by the exam boards. I hope that when the exam boards come to revise their syllabuses, real thought can be given to this. Thank you very much.